My wife Lacey was in a car crash in April of 2020. Well, not so much a car crash as a car winging her at her crossroads at 54 mph. She hit the pavement so hard it fractured parts of her throat and collarbone. Her left arm broke in 3 places. It was brutal. As I stayed with her and her family in the hospital, we had plenty of work. Worse, she had a serious concussion and we were anxious it might lead to something permanent. The doctors kept talking about the use of her left arm and her fine motor skills. It was only one single nurse who touched upon what would turn out to be the most permanent damage. Her throat. At first, the doctors just told her not to speak. We were told she had to rest and regain her strength, so there would be no speaking for weeks as her throat healed. She also had to wear a sort of neck brace, this awful-looking metallic thing. She was in desperately low spirits, but so very thankful for everything we did. As the weeks turned to months, most of her fractures and broken bones healed, but not her throat. Lacey still couldn't talk no matter how much she tried. I remember once when we stood in the kitchen, I looked her in the eyes and told her I loved her, and all she could say back was this wheezing whistle. She had some sort of panic attack and locked herself in the bathroom trying to scream. We went through a lot of trouble trying to restore her voice hour after hour of strenuous exercises. She even had a few minor surgeries. At one point she started drinking this sort of home remedy from something she learned online. She got stomach cramps for about 3 days afterwards. The result was always the same. Lacey cried a parade of disappointment and locked herself in the bathroom. Seeing her misery repeatedly made me impatient, so I joined her in her search for a cure, but it had to be something that was certain, since I couldn't bear to watch her let down once more. It's quite impossible to locate anything on the internet that can repair a damaged voice. Simply sifting through the scammers is my full-time job. In my spare time, I would check search alerts and participate on forums. I received some sincere comments, but the majority of them were links to dead ends or holistic rubbish, so I had to create a second email account just to manage the enrollment period. It took me 3 weeks to receive an email that I cared to read through, and it came from an auto-generated email account, but somehow it made it past my spam filter. It said, "Don't worry, I know what you're going through. I know someone who can help. Don't be alarmed and follow these simple rules." There were a few sincere responses with links to articles about experimental treatments and emerging technology, but nothing was accessible or even realistic. Take care of the seeds and one plant. Then, 3 days later, a small white envelope was dropped on our doorstep with an unmarked package of seeds inside. I thought about flushing them down the toilet, but I couldn't because the bathroom door was locked again. 2. Welcome the guest. 3. Listen to the song. And 4. Don't pick the white one. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was strange, but anyone who has been online for any length of time knows that people like to make things up all the time. Even though there was very little chance that this would work, I had to try, and I would do anything to make Lacey happy again. I just wanted to hear her call me. Lacey was crying, and the sound of her broken throat sniffling over the sink broke my heart so many times before I opened my mouth to speak, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I sowed the seeds in our flower bed in the front yard, watered them, and blamed myself for being a fool, since Sunny Bear is the best moniker I've ever had. It took less than a month for the seeds to turn into sprouts, which then turned into stalks, and from those stalks came these brilliant royal blue sunflowers. Although they were smaller than regular sunflowers, Lacey loved them and tried to bring some inside in a pot, but they kept dying, so we decided to keep them outside and let them grow and cheer us up whenever we left the house. However, 2020 was a crazy year because Lacey and I got into a fight one night and she got upset when I talked to him on. I noticed a shadow on our driveway. It wasn't technically on our property, but it was clear they were observing me from the road. I couldn't make heads or tails of their frame, but it was clearly a normal-sized person, possibly wearing a large coat. "Can I help you?" I asked loudly. There was no response. A brisk wind rattled the flower bed, which reminded me of that email I got way back. When it takes so little for the minds to travel to the most obscure crevices, I think I'm supposed to welcome you, I said. If not, well, have a good night, as I started walking back to the front door. I kept talking. It was nice just to talk again, but just you are welcome. Just to clarify, I took one more look back at the shadow on the driveway only to notice it was gone. Over the coming days I'd noticed Lacey standing by the window a few times. I'd ask her what she saw, but she'd just sigh and walk away. Soon I just stopped asking. Several times a day she'd stand by the front door or look out of the window. Every time she'd look in the same direction as where I'd seen that shadow of a person standing in the driveway. And yet there was nothing there. Not that I saw it was. By now we'd started sleeping in separate beds. She'd expressed how she felt pressured and sort of intruded upon, and that she wished for us to find our way back to each other with love rather than obligation and a sense of must. I couldn't blame her. Marriage takes work, and she wouldn't be happier if I forced her to do something she was uncomfortable with. Instead, I started sleeping in the guest bedroom. She'd still be kind enough to make the bed while I was at work. Though so not all was lost, there was warmth between us still. I didn't even think about the third rule: listen to the song. What song? It didn't make any sense, yet I found myself thinking about that list more and more. I'd done 2 things on it, and it hardly took any effort at all. It was almost as if it was being done to me rather than the other way around. But there was no song to listen to. At least there wasn't until I started listening to Lacey. She could still hum and hit all the tunes, but I had no idea what the song was. I asked her about it one day, and she replied with her speed up text. I'm not sure how long she had been humming it, but it was that kind of droning background noise that had always been there. Rhyme for the nursery. There was no way to simply look for the melody, but I couldn't quit thinking about it. It had a really boxy, mournful, and peaceful tune. Hell, I might as well go all the way if I were 3 points in on a 4-point list. I began humming it as well, so much so that I began to invent words for it. At one point during lunch, I took the time to write everything down so that Lacey would think I had written, "You're my friend, and I'll sing your tune, a setting sun to rising moon." I presented it to her as soon as I got home, and to say she didn't like it would be an understatement. I ask you, buddy friend blue, won't you also be a sunflower? She was more at a loss for words than usual and simply gazed at the paper. I tried to talk to her, but she was getting frantic again, so she locked herself in the bathroom and started crying more than normal. This time, I took it very hard, so I screamed and pounded on the door, but she didn't respond. For heaven's sake, Lacey, you need to attempt to provide me with something to work with. I'm right here. You're the one locking the door, and I'm standing right here. I'm with you, please. However, despite all the yelling and pounding, the door remained locked, and a piece of paper with the lyrics I'd made up for the song, which featured a big "screw you," was slid out from under the door. That night, I was at my breaking point, and even the blue sunflowers were drying up. I took a 2-hour walk through what was rapidly turning into a harsh storm, blowing leaves in my face the whole time. Sore after 3 drinks, I started talking about Lacey and her condition, and one of the brothers just nodded along. The other brother, however, just looked at me curiously as I stumbled into the subject of the odd email I'd received, and he just stared at me. They seemed eager enough to continue a conversation, if nothing else, so we could at least complain about work. I heard him say, "Ain't that the silver tongue game?" as the brothers exchanged glances. "You're right, Jord," the other brother coughed loosely. "That reminds me of, it seems that children who aspired to be talented singers used to play the silver tongue game in the 1910s. It was still a matter of discussion in the area and was considered a kind of forgotten superstition, but now that they brought it up, I dimly remembered hearing about it. The second rule, welcoming the guest, was a metaphor for violating a rule, and the first rule, planting and caring for the seed, wasn't intended to be literal at first. It was about daring children to swallow sunflower chairs and then drink as much water as they could. Welcome the guest was shorthand for doing something you're not supposed to do, because kids weren't supposed to welcome strangers into their homes. The third condition for listening to the song was to sing a particular nursery rhyme in front of other people. When the devil comes to give you a new tongue, don't pick the white one. It looks the most like silver, but it's not. I stepped away to text Lacey, but I got no response. The wind was getting stronger outside, and I was beginning to worry about getting home safely. The brothers were calling it a night, but they weren't in a condition to drive. They had a cab coming, but they were going the other way, so we said our goodbyes. Any adult who knew about the game would recognize it and punish you, but most adults tend to forget it as they get older. I was left standing in the parking lot, unsure of what to do or where to go. Eventually, I just started walking, which turned into a jog, which then turned into intermittent sprints. It dawned on me that I hadn't done anything wrong. I hadn't swallowed any sunflower seeds. I hadn't broken any rules, and I wasn't the one who started singing that song. Lacey had done all the same things, but in a proper way. If she was on the last step, what had she been doing? I was becoming anxious because I knew it was all superstition, but the sunflower seeds had appeared on our doorstep, and a stranger had been observing us. I returned home at midnight with my hands frozen, my heart racing, and I had no idea why I was becoming nervous. I fumbled for my house keys as I walked up the driveway only to discover the front door was open. I'm not sure when I started telling myself no, 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 but it was repeated like a dam. Lacey had been acting strangely lately and had been locking herself in the bathroom more frequently. The mantra of Hare Krishna Lacey when I yelled, the house was silent except for the wind rattling through the front door's cracks. I rushed to the toilet, only to discover it was still locked. I banged on the door in vain, and when I went outside to get my tools, I noticed a shadow stand in the driveway. There was a difference between this time and the first time I saw them. I'm not sure if it was the same thing, but when I turned on the light above the front door, the intruder emerged from the shadows. The image of this woman, who was easily 6 feet 5 inches yet crouched in a crouch, will always stick in my memory. Her unruly black hair like a bush and pointed in all directions. At first, I didn't even believe she had a face since her skin was so thin that I could see more of her skull than her features. It had a metallic gray and blue tone and a dry, rigid texture like cracked leather. Her thin lips were retracted in a strained grin, and her eyes were entirely gray. Her face hardly moved, but it didn't take long for me to notice that her mouth had curled into a smile. She was more malnourished than I had imagined a human could be, and she was only wearing a big fur-like cloak. I could see the edges of her nude knees, feet, and elbows protruding, and there was something on the inside of her cloak that said, "Tongues no." My mantra continued, "No, no, no." She began running at me as I began to back off into the garage. I slammed the door and pressed the lock. I was the one who locked myself in a room after hearing my loved one trying to enter, but it wasn't her. It couldn't be that thing outside. It had to be something else that couldn't be my Lacey. I stumbled over my workbench, knocking over tools and cables as I reached for the lock on the side door as I clicked it shut. I could hardly hear the wind outside as my heart swallowed all sounds except one. "Sunny Bear, are you there?" It took my reptilian brain a few seconds to recognize the voice, but it was Lacey's. "Are you there?" "Sunny Bear, you're not thinking clearly. I told you that it couldn't be you. It must be me. Please open up. Let's talk about this. Tell me what you wrote on the note." It became quiet. The wind was howling outside, drowning out my thoughts, and I could feel my heart pounding so hard that I felt like I was going to throw up. "Tell me what you wrote." I knew it took forever, but it must have only been 10 seconds. Eventually, the Lacey voice said, "Come out and she'll get a new one." "I don't trust you," because she went with the white one. You know that the voice had become black and poisonous, just maintaining a vague cadence of what was once Lacey. What does it even mean? "Sunny Bear will simply go. and you won't hear from her ever again. No more song SS, no more whispers. This completely irritated me, and I went from feeling teary-eyed to feeling happy. Panic into a fury fueled by stomach acid. Lacey was on the floor when I ran inside the home and used the wrench to break the lock on the bathroom door after swallowing my thoughts and feeling my dry tongue stick to the corners of my lips. I strengthened my grip on my wrench and opened the side door without anything. Her eyes were blank, her tongue was swollen and white, and she wasn't breathing. I dropped the wrench and fell to my knees, taking her in my arms and repeatedly saying, "No, no, I had to try something." I fumbled with my phone in my pocket, dialed 911 on speakerphone, and began administering CPR. I don't know how long we stayed there on the tear-stained floor, but I could hardly think as I screamed for help. I don't know how long we stayed there, but I know that after an eternity, Lacey gasped for air as we locked eyes, and I smiled. We didn't have to say anything to communicate, "Yes, I love you too," because large parts of her tongue had to be removed because of an infection that had spread to her mouth. She was in a serious condition, and her blood levels were all over the place, but she eventually recovered today. There are a lot of things that can be said without words, and when the need arises, we've started to adapt to new tools and tricks. Lacey's throat is fine, she still can't talk, but we're getting better. The trauma is still there, but she's seeing a regular therapist and working through her diagnosed PTSD, though I'm not sure I trust that therapist. Dr. Jane gives me some unsettling vibes. White bards on the fridge for good morning greetings, just mouthing "I love you" as I leave for work, and an earnest smile when I get home because I suspected Lacey had been following the same rules as me, but she had a little more background. She had ordered the same type of sunflower that kids used to eat the seeds off of back in 1910, the obscure Tamag sunflower that she had purchased from a collector. As for the second rule of doing something she wasn't supposed to, she had started smoking in TH for other scary, eerie reasons. Lacey informed me that they are all white. Horror stories about pastors. View the on-screen video or the playlist.